So in tonight's philosophical concept, we're going to continue in the mini-series of philosophical concepts that I've come up with over the years. And we are going to lead off the night with the impossible standard. This is all part of me basically archiving a note that I created on my Facebook page. I'll link to that note so you guys can follow along. Yes, there are some typographical errors, but unfortunately, because Facebook is phasing out notes, which I don't understand, I have no other way of archiving these things. So let me, in the comment section, let me know if, let me know your guys' thoughts, of course, on these concepts. And let me know if you think that there's a better place for me to be archiving and backing up these files. There are some typographical errors, like I mentioned, and I can't fix them because there's no way to do that at this point because Facebook is phasing out notes. It still exists, and you can still read it, and I'll put that link in this video's description again so you guys can follow along. But they are going to disappear in short order. So before we get in, real quick, just let me know what your thoughts are on these concepts as we go along. And quite frankly, I can't believe that I'm the one that's coined these concepts, though I've had them in my head for many years now. So let me know if there's already something in existence that either is these concepts. I don't know if I used that correctly, and explains these concepts. Let me know if there's already a term for the things we're going to be talking about, which tonight is going to be the impossible standard. And I'm just going to read the note, and you guys can follow along, and I'll try to explain as I go. I'm referring to moral or ethical standards whose internal nature is actually impossible to meet. This does not mean a standard which is necessarily beyond human capacity in the moment, nor does it refer to a standard which could be seen as wholly unrealistic. The impossible standard usually reveals itself in one of a handful of ways, but in every case what we're talking about is, in fact, an extension of bad faith, which we've talked about in this show briefly. We'll have to do another video on that. Part 1A, the Ad Hoc Standard. Now remember, when I refer to the impossible standard, these are standards that are actually impossible to meet. This is the impossible standard for which the legacy media are downright famous. The ad hoc version of the impossible standard is one in which the conditions for meeting the standard are made entirely ad hoc and are constantly moving at the whim of the individual establishing the standard. We've all seen it before. We just want you to apologize. Okay, I apologize. Not good enough. Now we want you to give money to this charity. Okay, I gave money to the charity. Not good enough. Now you have to change your views on this separate topic. Okay, I changed my views on this separate topic. Not good enough. And you see how this piles on. When this is the piling on of ad hoc. We've talked about ad hoc in these videos before. We'll probably have to do another video on ad hoc. The reason the standard is impossible to meet is because there's no way for the subject to know how the standard would or could fluctuate, and the standard could easily fluctuate constantly and ad infinitum, making it impossible for the subject to live up to this standard. So in this case, how do I know that that's the standard? How do I know that you're going to change the standard to this new standard when you change it to this new standard, especially if there's nothing you're basing that new standard on, or the introduction of that new standard on? Part 1B. As an extension to the above, a very common way this version can materialize is a standard in which there is, more generically, no way for the subject to adhere to because there's no reason to know the standard exists, and or the standard is one that requires both agency and consent of the subject, to which the subject has either not consented or who has had their agency removed in the establishment of the standard. This might sound a bit confusing, but the most common way this manifests is the quote-unquote, you have 24 hours to respond or else consequence, end quote, style of internet speak. Note that the consequence could be something as simple or mundane as assuming the position the subject does not accept. 2. The sins of the father. This is where we're probably going to get ourselves in trouble. We today are not confined by the conditions of today because those conditions might change tomorrow, which will eventually become today. However, people who lived and died 100 years ago cannot possibly live up to a standard which never existed in their time and must be injected into it post hoc. So post hoc and ex post facto are things that we're probably going to have to talk about in another video. Basically, it just means after the fact, or after it's possible for the standard to have been set in this case. Here's a rather innocuous example from baseball. So this is me explaining the sins of the father impossible standard. We today might consider 15 home runs in the season a forgettable number. We might reject the notion that someone meets the standard for a real slugger by hitting 15 home runs in one season. This is a really apt analogy. I wrote this before COVID, so this is a really an apt analogy now. But before the days of outfield walls, 15 home runs in a season was an unimaginable total, especially in what was known as the quote-unquote dead ball era. Dead ball coming largely from the fact that the same ball was used for either the entire game or nearly the entire game. So the ball would soften quite radically after having been beaten around for 9 innings. For the record, in a standard baseball game nowadays, you go through between 200 and 300 balls. So when Buck Freeman of the National League hit 25 home runs in 1899, that was considered a truly amazing total, not to be topped again until Babe Ruth hit 29 in the American League in 1919, a season which is usually used to define the end of the dead ball era. There's an asterisk to this, and that is that there was a player. Let me go to the asterisk because there's some weirdness with that home run total. Freeman didn't break the record of 27 home runs hit by Ned Williamson in 1884. Freeman's is considered the more meaningful feat because Williamson achieved his total as a result of a rules change that allowed him to hit 25 home runs at his home park, whose field dimensions wouldn't qualify for Little League today. 186 to left, 300 to center, and 190 to right. No joke, I can go to my Little League field right now and take pictures of it. They're larger than this field dimension. Previously, balls hit over the wall in that park were considered quote-unquote ground rule drop doubles. The rules change allowed the home team to set certain rules, which allowed Williams' team to consider any ball hit over their laughably short walls, even by the standards of their time, a home run. So imagine if somebody hit 25 home runs today in a small Little League field. So that's that asterisk to that record. Okay, so a season which usually did define. Freeman was considered one of the top sluggers of his era, and his home run total in 1899 was considered truly remarkable, more than doubling second place that season, and rightly 318, 25, 122, so 318 batting average, 25 home runs, 122 RBIs. Totals absolutely qualifies as a fantastic season and would probably have just earned him an MVP award and would probably have justly earned him an MVP award if one existed at the time. One didn't exist. Freeman would go on to hit 12, 11, and 13 home runs respectively in 1901 to 1903 and led the league, the American League at the time, again in 1903. So was Freeman a truly great power hitter? Absolutely, and probably the best of his era, having led the majors in home runs twice and having home run totals that were just not seen in his time. Would his numbers qualify him as a truly great power hitter by today's standards? Not a chance, not even close. The thing is that if a player today hits 318 batting average, 25 home runs, 122 runs batted in a season, still a very good season by today's standards, he could still go on to hit 40 home runs next season and 50 plus the season after that. So saying Mike Trout needs to hit 50 home runs in a season before you'll consider him a truly great power hitter may be objectionable and downright ridiculous if you followed baseball for any 10 minutes in the past decade. But not a necessarily impossible standard for Trout to live up to, because he is still playing today and could still hit 50 home runs in a season. But Buck Freeman played over 100 years ago and died more than 7 decades ago. Buck Freeman couldn't possibly live up to the standards of today with the data he produced over a century ago. Buck Freeman couldn't possibly live up to the standards of today because he doesn't live today. To say that a player needs to hit 50 or more home runs in a season during the dead ball era to qualify as a great power hitter is an impossible standard, because that would mean doubling the highest total ever hit during that era and during a time when the standard did not exist. So the standard at the time didn't exist. And the people that were alive in that era and could possibly live up to a certain standard are long dead. All of them are long dead. So it's impossible to live up to this standard. It's actually impossible. It's not it's not an unreasonable standard. It's actually a literally impossible standard to live up to because they're dead. It's not possible for a dead person to live up to any standard. Note that we could do that with the geocentric model of the universe in the pre-Galilean time, track and field records from decades past, standards of wealth in previous eras dating back to the Stone Age, and standards of acceptable levels of violence in, say, the Julian era, etc. Now let's get ourselves in trouble. We can extrapolate all of this to the moral standards of a given time, obviously. Slavery did not have the universally negative connotation in 1750 that it did even in 1950, let alone today. Excuse me. In fact, slavery was the norm by all means the world over in 1750, and the axiomatic evil we know it as today did not even begin to materialize until Thomas Jefferson penned the notion that, quote, all men are created equal, end quote, which created an obvious, on-paper contradiction with the practice of slavery. This contradiction is the exact reason George Washington came to despise the practice and why he would eventually use the will loophole to simultaneously free all of his slaves at once upon his death. This is why the 18th century abolitionist movement was actually more widespread and arguably more effective than those of the middle 19th century. This is why the British ended slavery in their colonies decades before the United States. It was done out of spite and to the newly formed United States. They wanted to spite us, so they did that. And this is why the slave owners of the Jacksonian era had to make up the previously basically non-existent excuse, and it was a bad excuse, that blacks were quote-unquote lesser men or not men to justify the continued existence of slavery. The same thing could be said about the use of the N-word. In times past, that was merely how blacks were titled. The titles have evolved over the years. In no particular order: Negro, colored, black, African American, person of color, etc. So to consider someone like Daniel Webster, considered one of the leading abolitionists of his time, a racist, because someone today dug up some old manuscript that included the use of the N-word or otherwise included a reference to blacks as Negroes, and I did that, by the way, would be ridiculous because you're using a standard that would be impossible for Daniel Webster, who died almost 170 years ago, to live up to. This is also the reason no one has any objection to the use of the N-word in period pieces, and is a huge part of why nobody considers Christoph Waltz or Leonardo DiCaprio racists for non-stop use of the word in Django Unchained. 3. The self-contradictory, internally logically impossible standard. This is the least common of the impossible standards. This is a standard which is impossible to achieve because of an internal logic constraint to contradiction. Most commonly, this is merely a Kafka trap, denial of guilt of a thing being an indicator of guilt of the thing. That's the definition of a Kafka trap. But it often means simply having two criteria for the meaning of a standard which are mutually exclusive, or more generically, conditions which create a paradox. So this is an impossible standard because it creates a paradox. Most innocuously, we've seen this in the hiring process. A position requires experience in the position to get the position, but you can't get the experience until you get the position, which you can't get until you have experience in the position. You see where this goes. Once everyone who has held the actual position retires or dies, then there will be no one with experience in the position. So no one will ever be able to fill the position if this is the standard for entry into the position. In this case, the standard creates a paradox, which makes it an impossible standard to meet. We've all been frustrated on this on the job hunt, I'm sure. If anyone here is a millennial or younger, I'm sure you've seen that job description that reads, it's an introductory level position that requires 5 years experience. Wait, what? How could you possibly have both 5 years experience and no experience in the field? Also, if you've got a position that's got a title, let's say it's a highly specific one, head groundskeeper at a baseball stadium. Well, if all of the head groundskeepers at baseball stadiums retired today, how would you fill that position if the requirement is experience being a head groundskeeper? It's this paradox in hiring process that we've all run into, I'm sure. In the political realm, this version of the impossible standard almost always emerges as a plain Kafka trap. So that's where if you deny the thing, you are the thing. How do you tell if someone is a hipster? Ask them, and if they say no, then they're a hipster. Denial of the thing being an indicator of guilt of the thing, or proof of the non-existence of the thing being proof of existence of the thing, which means that if you prove that the thing doesn't exist, it exists. If you prove the thing exists, it exists, which means that there's an impossible standard to meet to prove that something doesn't exist. There is usually an a prioristic position behind most Kafka traps that turns the Kafka trap into a moving standard. See 1a, Impossible Standards, Section 1, Part A. And the most obvious version of an internal logic impossible standard outside of a Kafka trap is that of the notion of white privilege. Told you we'd get ourselves in trouble. The existence of some forms of advantage associated with a skin color in the past must create some form of advantage today, regardless of how far removed the subject is from the time in which the advantage actually existed, and regardless of whether the advantage today can possibly prove tangible, measurable, or even observable. This can only be true if individual agency is removed entirely from the human condition, which is something that can only be argued for in an a prioristic manner. Either humans have agency or they don't. There's no way to prove that humans, generally speaking, have agency. There's no way to prove that they don't have agency. This is an a prioristic position on how you define the word agency. And in fact, actually, this dichotomy of agency versus non-agency is one that I think is defining the left and right, and the woke versus the not so woke. And we'll get into that in another video. I'll have to let me know if you want me to make a video on agency. In this case, it is logically impossible for white privilege to not exist. So the standard for its non-existence or removal, or ever reaching a standard of negligibility, is impossible to meet, even if the subject came from a different planet whose genetic evolution, by mere coincidence, identically matched Earth's, but with a mirror reversal of history based on race, and who came to Earth, a planet they otherwise knew nothing about, on a vacation or exploratory mission in the distant future, only to find the surface of the planet vaporized by some cataclysmic asteroidal collision. So if you guys have been following along in these concepts, remember the concept of dragon in my garage? So what's the difference then between it existing and not existing? If there's no possible way for it to not exist, then why should we act like there's some sort of mitigation effect that needs to happen so that it doesn't exist? If it's impossible to get rid of, what are we doing? 4, the immutability impossible standard. So there's 5 versions of this standard. So sit tight, folks. This is 4 out of 5. Arguably the most pernicious, arguably the most permissive, arguably the most pervasive. This is when a standard is associated with an immutable characteristic, and the subject is not in possession of the immutable characteristic. We've surely all seen this played out. You can have an opinion on this topic because you're race, sex, sexual orientation. You must be racist because you're insert race. You must be a sexist because you're insert sex. You must be a racist because you're not insert race. You're not allowed to tell that joke because you're race, sex, sexual orientation. In this case, the subject cannot possibly meet the standard for quote unquote having an opinion on this topic. In this case, the subject cannot possibly meet the standard for having an opinion on this topic because being/not being a racist, sexist, etc., or being allowed to tell a joke without pushback, because the subject cannot possibly exhibit the immutable characteristic. This is part of the definition of immutable. Unfortunately, to get around this, the standard setter has effectively created a situation in which tokenism becomes a prerequisite. If the subject cannot have an opinion because of their race, then someone of a different race with the same opinion must be substituted to carry on the debate. This is that side of the debate, engaging in good faith. Often, this is met with the accusation of tokenism, which is an example of type 3 impossible standard being put to play, and possibly type 1, and is a perfect example of how this all harkens back to bad faith in action. So, in this case, what we're talking about here with tokenism is if the complaint is, you can't have that position. You can't have that position because you're white. Okay, so let's substitute somebody who's of the race that you're looking for. Well, they're just a token then. Okay, so how am I allowed to have this position? So now we're a prioristically not allowed to have this position because it's it's that feedback loop. It's that paradox we keep talking about. In this case, it's an impossible standard because how do we ever achieve the standard where we're allowed to have this opinion? It's not possible. It's actually impossible. And I'll actually just close by saying there weren't 5 versions of the impossible standard. There were only 4. So you'll have to excuse me on all of this. So hopefully this video doesn't get yeeted. If you guys want to, you guys can check out my Teespring store, which has a shirt perfect for this topic about getting yeeted on YouTube. So if you want to support the channel, that's a great way to go ahead and do that. Link is in this video's description. And let me know what you guys think about the impossible standard. Night, folks.